The town of Redrock Crossing sat at the edge of a dry canyon like a man who had walked too far and could not decide whether to go back or fall. There were maybe 300 people living in it, if you counted the ones who slept in the livery and the ones who rented corners of the saloon floor. The main street was packed dirt that turned to thick mud when it rained and to cracked white clay when it did not, and it had not rained in 11 weeks. The buildings leaned into each other like old men sharing a secret. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon called the Red Lantern, a church that nobody used on Sundays anymore, and a jail that the sheriff kept locked even when it was empty, out of habit. The canyon to the west sent wind through the town every evening, a low moaning kind of wind that people had stopped noticing years ago. Children born in Redrock Crossing grew up thinking that sound was just what the world made. The older ones knew it had once bothered them. They just could not remember when they had stopped caring. Clay Dunnmore rode into that town on a Tuesday morning in October, when the light was thin and yellow and the dust rose in little columns along the street. He was not a large man. He was lean in the way that men get lean when they have ridden long distances and eaten poorly, and there was a quietness to him that people sometimes mistook for weakness. He wore a gray hat with a sweat-darkened band, a coat that had once been brown and was now the color of old wood, and boots that had been resoled twice. He had 2 guns on his belt, but the way he wore them was not showy. They sat low and practical, like tools on a workbench. He tied his horse at the post in front of a general store and went inside and bought a tin of peaches and a small sack of oats and asked the man behind the counter if there was work to be had anywhere nearby. The man behind the counter was named Gus Pruitt. He was bald and wore a canvas apron and had the kind of face that had seen everything and registered nothing. He looked at Clay for a moment, sizing him up the way men in small towns sized up strangers, trying to place him in a category that made sense. "Depends on the kind of work," Gus said. "Ranch work, fencing, driving cattle, whatever needs doing." Gus was quiet for a moment. He wrapped the tin of peaches in a piece of brown paper without being asked and slid it across the counter. The alderman spread east of town might be looking. "Lost 2 men last week." "Lost them how?" Gus looked at him. "They quit," he said, but his voice said something else. Clay nodded and paid and left. He ate one of the peaches sitting on the steps of a store and looked at the street and thought about what a man's voice sounded like when he was lying to cover for somebody else's trouble. He had heard that sound before. He had been hearing it his whole life, in different towns, with different faces in front of it. He did not ride out to the alderman's spread that day. Instead, he rented a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Colfax, paid 3 days in advance, put his horse in a livery, and spent the afternoon walking the town quietly, the way he always did when he arrived somewhere new. He listened more than he talked. He bought a coffee at the saloon and nursed it at the end of the bar and listened to 2 men argue about a fence line and listened to the bartender hum something tuneless while he washed glasses. He watched who came in and who left and how people looked at each other and how they looked away. By the time the sun was going down, he knew several things. He knew that the alderman's spread was owned by a man named Harlan Alderman, who had been in the territory for 20 years and who owned more land than any 10 other men combined. He knew that Harlan Alderman had 3 sons who rode with him, and that the sons had a reputation that people referred to with words like difficult and rough, and then went quiet. He knew that there was a family named Voss that had a small farm 5 miles east of town, on a piece of land that happened to sit between the alderman's spread and the river. And he knew, from the way people's eyes moved when the name Voss came up, that something was happening out there that the town had decided was not its business. He slept that night in his rented room with one hand on his gun, which was how he always slept, and he dreamed about nothing, which was also how he always dreamed. The next morning he rode east. The Voss farm appeared after 5 miles as a small cluster of buildings on a flat piece of land with a creek running behind it. There was a house, a barn that needed painting, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden that had been worked carefully. Sunflowers grew along the fence line, tall and dry now in October, their heads hanging. There was a mule in the small paddock and 2 goats and a dog that announced Clay's arrival from 50 yards out. He stopped his horse at the gate and waited. That was the polite thing. You stopped and you waited, and you let whoever was inside decide whether to come out. A woman came to the door of the house, She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back hard and hands that showed years of outdoor work. She stood in the doorway without stepping out, one hand on the door frame, and she looked at Clay the way people looked at strangers when they had already had too much experience with strangers who meant them harm. "Help you," she said. "Just passing through." Clay said, "Wondered if you needed any work done. I'm good with fences, with animals, with building." She studied him. "We don't need help." "All right." He touched his hat. "Beg your pardon." He turned the horse. He had gone maybe 20 yards when she said, "Wait." He stopped and turned. She was still in the doorway, but something in her face had shifted. Something that had been held tight had loosened just slightly. "You're not from around here," she said. "No, ma'am." "You don't know Harlan Alderman." "I know the name." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The fence on the north side needs mending. There's a post that's rotted through and 3 rails down. I can pay $2 for the work." "I'll do it for 1, he said. She looked at him again. "The lumber's in the barn." He spent the morning mending the fence. He worked steadily and did not rush and did a clean job, setting the new post deep and making sure the rails sat level. The woman, whose name was Ruth Voss, brought him water twice and stood near him for a while the second time, watching him work with an expression that was not quite relief, but was something close to it. She told him, without being asked, that she had a daughter named Elsa who was 18 and who was at the moment in town getting supplies. She told him this the way you told a stranger something when you needed to say it out loud to someone, because you had been carrying it and the weight had become too much. "She should have been back by now," Ruth said. Clay drove the last nail and checked the rail. "How long's too long?" he said. "She left at first light. It's past noon." He said nothing. He gathered the tools and put them back in the barn. He washed his hands at the pump. He thought about the name Alderman and the way people's eyes moved when they heard it. "I'll ride into town," he said. "See if everything's all right." Ruth looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. He was saddling his horse when they heard it. It started as a sound without a shape, a distant kind of noise that could have been anything, and then it got closer and got a shape, and the shape was hooves, many of them moving fast. Clay was in the saddle before Ruth had taken 3 steps toward the gate. He saw them come over the low rise to the east. 4 riders, moving hard. In front of them, being dragged, was Elsa Voss. She was tied by a rope around her wrists, and the rope was attached to the saddle of the lead rider, a big man on a black horse, and she was being pulled along the ground behind him. She was not being dragged at full gallop, not yet, but she was off her feet, being bounced and pulled across the dry grass and hard earth, and she was fighting it, trying to get her feet under her, trying to get her balance. But the pace was too fast, and the ground was too uneven. Clay did not think. There's a kind of action that happens before thought, that comes from years of practice and a particular kind of mind, and that was what happened to him. He put his horse into a run immediately, cutting at an angle to intercept them, and as he ran he drew his rifle from the scabbard on the saddle. Ruth screamed behind him. He heard it, but it was already behind him, and he did not look back. The riders saw him coming, and the lead man, the one with the rope attached to his saddle, pulled up slightly, surprised. He was not expecting another rider. He had not expected anyone at all. He had expected to do what he was doing until it was finished. Clay's horse was fast, and he cut the angle well, and he came up alongside the rope at a dead run. He had 1 second, maybe less, and in that second he looked at where Elsa Voss was, and where the rope was, and what would happen if he missed. She was tumbling, trying to get her feet under her hair full of dust, and her face bleeding from somewhere. The rope was taut and bouncing with the motion of the horse. He fired once. The rope snapped. Elsa Voss tumbled forward, and Clay was already off his horse, hitting the ground running, and he caught her before she fully hit the earth. He went down with her, taking the impact on his shoulder and his back, rolling with her, ending up on his knees in the dry grass with her in his arms, and the dust settling around both of them. There was a moment of silence, the kind of silence that happens after something violent, when the world seems to pause and decide what comes next. Then one of the riders shouted something, and Clay heard hooves turning and coming back. He got to his feet and stood between Elsa and the riders. She was conscious. She was bleeding from her forehead and her palms, and one of her knees was torn, but she was breathing, and she was looking up at him with dark eyes full of shock and a strange, desperate clarity. "Get behind me," he said quietly. She got to her feet, unsteady, and moved behind him. The 4 riders came up and stopped maybe 30 feet away. The lead man on the black horse was Harlan Alderman's oldest son, whose name was Price Alderman. He was 28 years old and had grown up knowing that his father owned everything and that he would inherit everything, and that knowledge had done nothing good for his character. He was handsome in the way that men are sometimes handsome when they have never had to earn anything, a careless, thoughtless kind of looks, and he was angry now in the way that careless men get angry when something interrupts them. The other 3 were his brothers, and a hired man named Cutler who rode with them and did the things they preferred not to think too hard about. "Who the hell are you?" Price said. Clay did not answer immediately. He stood, and he looked at Price Alderman the way you look at something you are evaluating, not with fear, with the particular attention of a man who needs to understand something quickly. "The man who just cut your rope," Clay said. "That rope was attached to my property." "The rope was. The girl wasn't." Price's jaw tightened. "That girl's family owes my father money. Land debt. When people don't pay what they owe, there are consequences. There are other ways to collect a debt. My father decides what ways are used." Clay shifted slightly. His hand was not on his gun. It was hanging loose at his side, but something about the way it was hanging made it clear that the distance between that hand and that gun was very small. "I don't think you're going to touch her again," he said. "I think you're going to ride back to wherever you came from and talk to your father about a different way to handle this." Price stared at him. The stare was supposed to be intimidating. It was the kind of stare that had worked on farmers and smallholders and frightened women all his life. It did not work on Clay. Clay had been stared at by men who were considerably more dangerous than Price Alderman, and he had been stared at by enough of them that the stare itself meant nothing to him. One of the brothers, the second one, named Rec, moved his hand toward his gun. Clay's gun was out before Rec's hand got there. He did not point it at Rec. He pointed it at Price. "Tell him to stop," Clay said. Price looked at the gun and then at Clay's face, and he said, "Rec, hold." Rec held. There was a long moment. The wind came through, that canyon wind, low and dry. Elsa was breathing hard behind Clay. A horse stamped. "This isn't over," Price said. "Most things aren't," Clay said. Price turned his horse, and the other 3 turned with him, and they rode back the way they had come, fast, throwing up a long tail of dust that drifted slowly south in the wind. Clay watched until they were out of sight. Then he put the gun away. He turned to Elsa. She was standing in the dry grass with her torn hands held slightly out from her sides and her hair full of dust and blood on her face, and she was staring at him. She was not crying. She had been dragged across hard earth at the end of a rope, and she was not crying. He had seen men break from considerably less. "You need to get back to your mother," he said. She nodded. She did not say anything yet. She was still in the place that people go after something terrible, the quiet place where the body is doing the work and the mind is still arriving. He helped her onto his horse and led it back toward the farm on foot. Ruth Voss met them at the gate, and she made sounds that mothers make when they have been terrified and then given relief, sounds that were not quite words. She pulled Elsa down from the horse and held her and looked at her injuries with a mother's hands, moving across her face and arms with a quick, thorough tenderness. Then she looked at Clay over her daughter's shoulder. She did not say thank you. The words were too small for what had happened, and she knew it, and he knew it. She just looked at him, and he nodded, and that was enough. Inside the house, he cleaned up while Ruth tended to Elsa. It was a small house, clean and carefully kept, the kind of house that a person makes when they have little money, but a lot of pride and care. There were curtains on the windows, handmade. There was a shelf of books. There was a photograph on the wall of a man who had to be Ruth's husband, gone now from the way nobody mentioned him. When Elsa came back into the main room, she had been cleaned up and bandaged, and had changed her clothes, and looked steadier, though still pale under her tan. She sat down at the table and looked at Clay. "You shot a rope at a gallop," she said, "from the back of a moving horse." "Wasn't quite a gallop," he said. "Still, Practice, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Why did you help me? You don't know us. He thought about how to answer that. He had been asked versions of that question before, in other towns, after other things. He never had a completely satisfying answer. Because nobody else was going to, he said. And because it was wrong. She looked at him carefully. Men who can do what you just did don't usually do it for reasons like that. Maybe that's the problem, he said. Ruth brought coffee, and they sat for a while, the three of them, and Ruth and Elsa explained the situation with a directness that came from having nothing left to hide. The farm had belonged to Ruth's husband Thomas, who had died of fever 2 years back. He had taken a loan from Harlan Alderman 4 years ago, before the drought, when the farm was producing well and the future seemed manageable. The loan had been for $200, used to repair the barn and buy the mule and a few other necessities. The terms of the loan, as Thomas had understood them, were straightforward, but Alderman had a lawyer from a county seat who had drawn up papers that Thomas, who could read but was not a careful reader of legal language, had signed without fully understanding. There were penalties and interest rates buried in those papers that had, over 4 years, turned $200 into something much larger. And then Thomas died, and the farm's production had dropped, and the debt had grown. Alderman wanted the farm. He had always wanted it. It sat between his land and the river, and it was the piece he needed to control water access for his entire eastern range. The debt was a tool, not a goal. The goal was the farm. He's offered to clear the debt if we give him the land, Ruth said. Which means you'd have nothing. Clay said. Yes. And if you don't give him the land? She looked at her hands. You saw today what happens. Clay was quiet for a while. He drank his coffee. Outside the window the sunflowers moved in the wind, heavy-headed and patient. He thought about what he had ridden into and what it would mean to keep riding and what it would mean not to. Do you still have the original papers? He said. Ruth looked at him. The loan papers? Yes. I have everything Thomas ever kept. I'd like to see them, he said. She brought them from a box under the bed. Clay spread them on the table and read them carefully. He was not a lawyer, but he had lived a long life in places where legal documents were often used as weapons, and he had learned to read them. What he found was not exactly fraud. It was something worse, in a way, because it was legal. The terms were real, but they had been explained to Thomas Voss in ways that were technically accurate, but practically deceptive. There were 2 clauses that stood out. One established that the loan could be called in full at any time if Alderman judged that the property value had declined. The other established interest that compounded monthly rather than annually, which was buried in language designed to obscure it. This is a trap, Clay said, built with real wood and real nails. Can it be fought? Elsa said. Anything can be fought. Clay said. Whether you win is different from whether you fight. He set the papers down. There's a judge in the county seat. Judge Haverford, Ruth said. He's been there 15 years. Is he honest? The 2 women looked at each other. He's not Alderman's judge, Ruth said, but he's not a brave man. Clay nodded. I need to think, he said. He stayed that night at the farm, sleeping in the barn with his horse, and he thought through the night the way he thought through things, slowly and carefully, turning them over, looking at them from all sides, discarding what was not useful and keeping what was. The situation was this. Alderman had legal tools and men with guns and the weight of established power in the territory. Ruth and Elsa had a piece of paper that was technically valid but practically unjust. No money, no men, no power. The town of Redrock Crossing had decided this was not its business. The law was distant and uncertain. What Clay had was a rifle, 2 guns, a fast horse, and a lifetime of experience in difficult situations. He also had something that he did not think of as a gift, but that other people sometimes recognized as extraordinary, which was the ability to look at a complicated problem and find the one thing in it that was both true and useful. In this case, the true and useful thing was this. Harlan Alderman was a man who had operated for 20 years by making sure that nobody pushed back. When people pushed back, he pushed harder, and eventually they broke or left. But that only worked if the person pushing back had something to lose. Clay had very little to lose. He had a horse, his guns, 3 days paid lodging at Mrs. Colfax's boarding house, and the peaches he had not yet eaten. A man with very little to lose was a particular kind of problem for a man like Alderman, because the usual tools did not work on him. In the morning he rode into town and sent a telegram to the county seat, to the office of a man he knew slightly, a territory marshal named Farron, who was neither perfectly honest nor perfectly dishonest, but who was essentially fair, which was rarer and in some ways more useful. The telegram said that there was a land dispute in Redrock Crossing involving coercive debt collection and physical assault on a woman, and asked Farron to come when he could. Then he went to the Red Lantern Saloon and asked for a meeting with Harlan Alderman. The bartender looked at him. "You know who Harlan Alderman is?" "I know the name." The bartender looked at him for a long moment, then went through a door at the back. After about 10 minutes he came back and said that Alderman would see him that afternoon. Clay went back to his room and cleaned his guns and waited. Harlan Alderman arrived at the saloon at 2 in the afternoon. He was 60 years old and built like something that had been compressed over many years until it was very dense. He had white hair and a white beard trimmed short and eyes the color of bleached canvas. He came in with Price and Rec walking behind him, and he sat down at the corner table and looked at Clay the way a man looks at something he is considering buying or discarding. Clay sat across from him. He had not brought his guns to the table. He had left them on his belt where they always were, but he had not made any kind of gesture toward them. He sat with his hands in front of him on the table, calm. "You're the man who cut my son's rope," Alderman said. "Yes, that was my property, the rope and the girl attached to it, in terms of what she owes me." "People aren't property," Clay said. "She's collateral on a debt." "That's not what collateral means." Alderman looked at him. He was not used to being corrected. He had been in this valley for 20 years, and nobody corrected him, because correcting him had consequences. He studied Clay for a moment and then said, "What do you want?" "I want you to clear the Voss debt and let the family keep their farm." Alderman was quiet. Then he almost smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "Why would I do that?" "Because the alternative is worse for you." "In what way?" Clay put his hands flat on the table. "Yesterday your son dragged a woman behind a horse through public land. She has injuries that can be documented. I have sent a telegram to Marshal Farron in the county seat asking him to come out and look into a complaint of assault and attempted bodily harm. When Farron gets here, there will be an investigation. That investigation will likely look at other things too. The way the Voss loan was structured, whether the explanations given to Thomas Voss at the time of signing were accurate, whether other people in this area have had similar experiences with Alderman loans and Alderman debt collection." Alderman's expression did not change. He was a man who had long practice at keeping his face steady, but something behind his eyes shifted. "You're bluffing," he said. "The telegram's already sent," Clay said. A moment of silence. Price, standing behind his father, was staring at Clay with an expression of pure, focused hatred. Clay noted it and set it aside. "Farron isn't going to come out here over a rope," Alderman said. "Farron's going to come out here because I asked him to and because I told him what I saw, which is a woman being dragged across open ground by 4 men. He's going to come out because if he doesn't and something worse happens, it's on his record. Farron's not a courageous man, but he's a man who thinks about his record." Alderman considered this. Clay could see the calculation happening, the same calculation that a man like Alderman always made, the one where he weighed the cost of compliance against the cost of resistance. "The farm's worth $2,000, Alderman said. "The debt is $600. The debt as represented to Thomas Voss was $200. The debt is legally structured. Is something a judge will be asked to look at," Clay said, "along with the question of whether the explanation given at signing was adequate and honest. That's a question about fraud, Mr. Alderman, not about contract law. About fraud, which is a different kind of problem." Alderman looked at him for a long time. "Who are you?" he said. "Nobody in particular." "Nobody in particular doesn't ride into a town they don't know and cut ropes and send telegrams to marshals." "I suppose most people don't," Clay said. "Why do you care about these people?" Clay thought about that. He had thought about it through the night. "Because I can," he said simply. "Because it's wrong and I have the ability to do something about it, and there's nothing stopping me except the possibility of dying, which is true every day and isn't a reason." Alderman sat with that for a moment. It was not the answer he had expected. Men who interfered with his business usually did it for money or for personal reasons, rivalries or old grievances. A man who did it simply because he could and because it was right was a harder problem, because you could not buy him and you could not threaten him with things he cared about, because there was nothing he cared about enough to stop him. "I'll think about it," Alderman said. "Don't think too long," Clay said. "Farron moves faster than people expect." Alderman stood and his son stood with him. He looked at Clay one more time, and then he left without another word. That evening Price Alderman came back to the saloon without his father. He came in with Cutler and one other man, and they sat at a table not far from where Clay was eating, and they looked at him in a way that was meant to be felt. Clay finished his meal and paid and walked out. He was halfway down the street when he heard them behind him. He stopped and turned. Price was in the street with Cutler on one side and the other man on the other. The street was empty, which was not accidental. It was evening, and the merchants had closed up, and there was nobody around who would need to see anything or remember anything. "My father's going to think about things," Price said. "I'm not thinking. I'm telling you that you should be on your horse and moving before morning." Clay looked at him. "No," he said. "You don't understand. I understand that you think the world is yours because your father made it feel that way." Clay said, "I understand that you've never had someone look at you and say no and mean it and not move. I'm saying it. I'm not moving." Price's hand went for his gun. What happened next happened very fast. Clay drew and fired in the time it took Price to get his gun clear of the holster, and he shot the gun out of Price's hand, which was an extraordinarily difficult shot, and one that Clay made not because it was elegant, but because killing Price Alderman would create problems that he did not want. Price cried out and grabbed his hand, and the gun was in the dirt, and Cutler and the other man were absolutely still. Clay kept his gun out. He looked at Cutler. "Pick his gun up," he said. "Take it with you. Go home." Cutler picked up the gun, and they went. Price was standing in the street holding his hand, which was bleeding, but not badly. A shot hand was painful and embarrassing, but not lethal. He was looking at Clay with something that had started as hatred and was now edged with something else, something that Clay recognized as the beginning of genuine fear. "Go home," Clay said. Price went. Clay stood in the street alone for a while after they had gone. His hand was steady. He was not young anymore, and things that had once been easy were not always easy. But this was still easy, because he had done it so many times and in so many places that it was simply what he did. He thought about whether he was sorry, and he was not sorry. He thought about whether he had done right, and he thought he had, or as close to right as this kind of situation allowed. He went back to his room and slept. In the morning, a boy came to the boarding house with a message. The message was from Harlan Alderman, and it said that he had reconsidered his position and would like to meet again to discuss terms. They met at the saloon. This time Alderman came alone. He looked older in the morning light. He still looked like something compressed and dense, but something in him was tired. Clay thought that he had probably always been tired and had been covering it with 20 years of power. They talked for an hour. At the end of the hour, they had agreed on the following. The Voss debt would be cleared and the papers destroyed. Alderman would make no further approaches to Ruth or Elsa Voss regarding the land. In exchange, Clay would not pursue the assault complaint further with Marshal Farron, provided Farron was willing to let the matter drop given a satisfactory resolution. And Price Alderman's conduct would be a private matter, handled within the family. Clay was not happy with all of this. He would have preferred a fuller accounting. But he was a practical man, and he knew the difference between justice and what was achievable. And he had learned long ago that insisting on perfect justice sometimes meant getting none at all, while accepting imperfect resolution meant that people could keep living their lives. He rode out to the Voss farm that afternoon and told Ruth and Elsa what had been agreed. Ruth sat very still when he told her. Elsa sat beside her. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Ruth said, "It's done? The debt?" "He'll have the papers by end of week," Clay said. "If he doesn't follow through, Farron will be here by then anyway, and you can show him the agreement we made this morning, which I had Gus Pruitt witness at the general store." Ruth looked at her hands. "Why?" she said. Not a question exactly. More a thing she was saying to the air. "Why what?" Elsa said, "Why does a man we never met do all this?" Clay was quiet for a moment. "There's a thing that happens," he said slowly. "When people see something wrong and they think, that's terrible, but it's not my problem. And then the next person thinks the same thing. And the next. And eventually nobody does anything because everyone decided it was someone else's problem. I've ridden through a lot of towns, and I've seen a lot of that. And what I've noticed is that the people who think it's not their problem are usually the people who are safe. The ones that actually is a problem for don't have the option of deciding." Elsa looked at him. "You weren't safe," she said. "You could have ridden on." "Yes," he said, "but you didn't." "No." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that had the same particular steadiness that her mother's had, something that came from working hard land and surviving real things. "Will you stay?" she said, and then she looked slightly away, adding quickly, "There's work here. Real work. The north fence needs more than one post." He almost smiled. "There's a lot of fences need mending in this world," he said. "There are," she said, "but you have to start somewhere." He stayed. Not because of any one thing. He stayed because the farm needed work, and he was good at work. He stayed because Farron arrived 4 days later, and there were things to be said and documented, and having him there made things go more smoothly. He stayed because after Farron left, and the agreement held and the papers were delivered and destroyed, there was still a barn that needed painting, and a roof section that had soft patches, and a well that was losing water somewhere underground. He stayed because the work was real and the people were real, and sometimes that was enough. In November the rain came back after 11 weeks, coming in from the northwest in long gray sheets that made the dry canyon moan differently, a lower sound with more water in it. The creek behind the Voss farm ran strong for the first time in months, and the ground turned dark and soft, and the sunflowers that had stood dry and heavy-headed were knocked down by the rain and lay in the mud, but their seeds were already distributed, already in the ground, already becoming next year. Clay repaired the roof on the last dry afternoon before the rain started, and came down off it just as the first drops hit the ground. Ruth called him in for supper, and Elsa poured coffee, and they sat at the small table in the lamplit room while the rain came down outside, and the sound of it on the roof was the sound of something that had been needed for a long time arriving at last. There are things that people will tell you about the old frontier, about the men who carried guns and settled disputes and moved through small towns like weather, passing through and leaving change behind them. Most of those things are stories that have been simplified until the complication is gone. In the real version, the man is not a hero. He is a person who made choices, some of them good and some of them costly, and he lived with what those choices made of him and the world. Harlan Alderman did not become a good man. He became a more careful man, which is not the same thing, but has some of the same practical effects. Price Alderman carried a scar on his gun hand for the rest of his life, and never fully understood what it had taught him, though it had taught him something. The way all pain teaches something even when the lesson is only that certain things are possible. Rex Alderman eventually left the territory and went north and became, according to rumor, a reasonably honest cattle broker. The town of Redrock Crossing continued to be a town at the edge of a canyon, the canyon wind moving through it every evening. But people in it thought differently, for a while, about what was their business and what was not. It did not last forever. Things like that never last forever. But it lasted long enough for Ruth and Elsa Voss to plant a new crop in the spring, and long enough for the north fence to stay straight through the winter, and long enough for two women who had been on the edge of losing everything to find solid ground under their feet again. Clay stayed through the winter. He did not decide to stay through the winter. He simply kept not leaving. The way you sometimes stay in a place when the work is real and the people around you are real, and the reasons to leave get smaller day by day. He fixed a barn and the well, and built a new chicken coop, and cut wood, and learned the rhythms of the farm the way you learn the rhythms of a place when you live in it rather than passing through. He and Elsa did not talk much, but they worked alongside each other in a way that said things without words. There's a kind of communication that happens between people who trust each other and who have been through something real together, a shorthand that is not about cleverness, but about understanding. He knew when she was worried about something before she said it. She knew when something was sitting heavy on him before he showed it. One evening in December, with snow coming down outside for the first time that season, She asked him about where he had been before Redrock Crossing. He thought for a moment. "A lot of places," he said. "What were you doing in all those places?" "The same thing mostly," he said. "Looking for somewhere I could stay." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, and the snow was quiet outside. The first snow quieter than any other. "Did you find it?" she said. He looked around the small room. The curtains, the shelf of books, the photograph on the wall of a man he had not known but had come to know something of, through the two women who carried him in their faces. "I think so," he said. "There is a temptation, when telling a story like this, to end it with a tidy lesson spelled out clearly, so that nobody can miss it. But the lesson of a life is not a sentence. It is the whole thing, the accumulated weight of choices made and not made, of times you rode on and times you didn't, of ropes cut and ropes not cut, and what that cost and what it gained. The lesson of Clay Dunnmore's life was not written on his face or in the way he wore his guns. It was written in the places he had been and what he had done there, in the fences he had mended and the debts he had witnessed erased, and the rope he had shot in one clean moment while riding at speed toward something terrible. The lesson, if you must have one, is this: the world does not get better by itself. It gets better when someone who can do something decides that the fact that they can is sufficient reason to act, without waiting for permission or payment or gratitude. It gets better when the man who could ride on turns his horse instead and rides toward the sound. It gets better not because such men are heroes, which is a word that makes a thing smaller than it is, but because they are simply people who have learned that doing nothing is its own kind of choice, and they have chosen not to make it. There are always ropes that need cutting. There are always people being dragged toward something terrible by forces they cannot fight alone. And there are always people who have the means to do something, and the question is only whether they will or won't. Clay Dunnmore, who was nobody in particular and who had said so, who had no great ambition and no special mission, who had ridden into a town on a Tuesday in October with a tin of peaches and a quiet way of moving, had spent his whole life answering that question the same way. Not because he was trying to prove anything, not because he expected reward, simply because it was wrong and he could, and there was nothing stopping him except the question of whether he would. He would. He always would. And that, more than any shot he had ever made or any deed that anyone might have put a name to, was the thing that mattered. The willingness to act, the willingness to show up, the willingness to stand between a woman and the men dragging her across the ground and say no and mean it without flinching. The winter deepened. The farm held. The creek ran under ice and came out the other side in March still running, as creeks do when they are fed by something real and deep. The sunflower seeds that had fallen in November came up in May, tentative and pale at first, then greening quickly, reaching toward a sun that was warmer now and more patient. Ruth Voss planted her new crop. Elsa worked beside her and beside Clay, and the three of them made something in that second year that the first year had not had, which was a future. Not a grand future, not a dramatic one, a quiet future, full of ordinary work and ordinary weather and the small daily decisions that make a life. The canyon wind still came every evening, but by now Clay had stopped noticing it, which meant he had become a part of the place. Not a visitor anymore, not a man passing through, something that belonged. He hung his rifle above the door of the barn one afternoon in May, not because he thought he would never need it again. He was not foolish enough to think that, but because there was a difference between being ready and living as if he were always at war, and he was trying to learn, late in his life, what it felt like to put the weapon down without putting down the willingness. The willingness stayed. It would always stay. That was who he was, built from the ground up by every choice he had made since he was young, and the world had first shown him what it was capable of doing to people who had no one to stand for them. He stood for them. He always had. He always would. And sometimes, in the particular light of a high clear afternoon in May, with the creek running and the sunflowers coming up along the fence and the two women he had come to know like family moving through the ordinary business of a day, he thought that this, right here, was the reason. Not an abstract reason, not a principle written on paper. These people, this farm, this life that existed because one rope had been cut at exactly the right moment by exactly the right shot. He thought about that shot sometimes, the way the rope had snapped, The way she had tumbled forward, and he had already been moving, already off the horse, already going toward her. He had not hesitated. There had been no hesitation in him, and he thought that the thing that had made the shot possible was not skill, though skill was part of it, and not courage, though courage was part of it too. What had made the shot possible was that he had already decided, years before, in some other town, in some other situation, that when it came down to it he would act. He had already answered the question, so when the moment came there was no question to answer. There was only the action. That is, perhaps, the most honest thing that can be said about it. The decision is not made in the moment. The decision is made long before, in the quiet times, in the ordinary times, when you look at who you are, and what you believe, and what you are willing to do. And then when the moment comes, you are simply already decided. The shot is just the expression of something that was true about you before you ever raised the rifle. Decide now who you will be when it counts. And then, when it counts, be that.